Now, the 6th ANC National Policy Conference officially kicks off at the Nasrec Expo Centre, south of Johannesburg today. Party President Cyril Ramaphosa expected to address the gathering later this morning. The policy indaba of the governing party is called to review policies made at the last conference and to track their implementation. Samkele Maseko is standing by with us for an update. Samkele, very good morning to you. You've spoken to different officials this morning. Are you getting a sense of what will happen at the policy conference, even though the start of the official program has been delayed a bit?
Indeed, Desiree, the start of the official 6th policy conference of the governing party has been delayed. One of the presidents, either the deputy president or the president of the ANC, has arrived here at Nasrec for the 6th policy conference of the governing party. It comes at the backdrop of high escalating fuel prices in the country, a sluggish economy, and an Eskom failing to provide energy security within the country. You've had the president also addressing the nation on the future of the country's energy security and the bringing on stream of independent power producers and the role that power utility Eskom will also play. There are also a various number of proposals, particularly when you look at the escalating fuel prices in the country and how they are proposing that SAPREF be bought, which is a refinery of Total and Engine, which is out within Durban, so that South Africa can have its own capacity to generate its own oil and fuel. There's also the exploration of oil and gas within the Eastern Cape coastline, which is being pioneered by the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, Gwede Mantashe. But there is also Prof. Susan Booysen with us to further unpack the ANC's policy proposals. When you look at their dwindling ethereal fortunes, you look at how they failed to change Section 25 of the Constitution, which will permit for land expropriation without compensation in the changing political landscape of the country. Prof, the ANC's policy proposals pretty much inward looking at what has currently transpired within the state and not looking forward to governance, looking forward to what they can do. There are issues being raised of the basic income grant. When you browse through the ANC's policy documents, what was your overall assessment just looking through them, Prof?
Samkele, yes. The first fact is that between these different policy documents, one sees quite a sense of being scattered, of not a clear outward-looking, forward-looking focus. One can even compare this conference 5 years ago and, for example, land. That is the story of the difference between two conferences. Then it was the mobilization, the expectation that there could be radical economic transformation, radical land reform, even appropriation without compensation, etc., etc. That kind of fervor, not just about land, but in general, is totally missing, not just from the conference, from the run-up to the conference, but also in the policy documents that have been put together. It is as if the state ANC, after getting close to 30 years in power, is struggling to differentiate between itself and the state. Several of these policy documents sound really and appear as if a government department had been writing that. There is no in-depth discussion of different alternative policies. It's little options here and there, as you rightly point out, quite a few proposals also in terms of energy and the energy crisis. And then other politics had eclipsed that. For example, President Cyril Ramaphosa's announcement just a few days ago of the strategy, mapping that strategy. It will be interesting to see what a conference like this can come up with in terms of policy proposals in the wake of that type of forced comprehensive announcement, forced by circumstances of the all surrounding energy crisis. On land, it appears, sadly in many respects, as if that is really water under the bridge. As I said, that kind of fervor is no longer available, not evident from the delegates that we've seen around. And it is ANC policy proposals having hit that ceiling of parliamentary majorities, of constitutional change required to change the constitution in terms of getting more radical land policy. And that is one of the big questions one has coming into this conference. What is the extent of power? What is the extent of ability to change policies, not just after having overseen some policy for close to 3 decades, but in terms of what is new, what policy can be taken forward by the President and his executive in these circumstances.
Prof, when you look at the ANC's electoral fortunes, them no longer having that majority within the National Assembly, they failed to pass the bill and the legislation to change Section 25 of the Constitution to permit for land expropriation with nil compensation. You've had a resolution by the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal which says they want the original resolution of the 54th National Conference of land expropriation with no compensation to be fully implemented to the T. When you look at this debate on land, it's pretty much died down. Ronald Lamula and Matolo Motsecha presented the ANC's proposed bill to Parliament. It was shot down. Majority of the parties voted against it and they failed to push it through. What does this signal when the debate is pretty much dead and buried?
Yes, it really signals how few policy options the ANC has, because it's not just the ANC, and the ANC has lost its two-thirds majority quite a while ago by now, and there is no prospect of recovering that two-thirds majority. They even could be lucky just to get an outright majority of 50% plus, if at all. And so the policy options are really limited, and we see in these policy documents really muted minor points of discussion on land. For example, how can more land be made available by the state? How can a process be fast-tracked? How can it be used for residential development? A kind of minor points of improvement and tweaking. So far at this conference, we do not see the big upwelling of sentiment of mobilization for a big policy change. Rather, we look at these tiny points of perhaps further tweaking and improvement, and that at some point is going to come head-to-head with a younger generation, more radical leaders in the ANC coming to the fore, but those leaders are going to come head-to-head with the fact that the ANC has a dwindling majority and that there are limits to what they can do in terms of policy. Those days are long gone.
Prof, when you also look on the issue, particularly pertaining to land, the former Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, and also ANC NEC member said that the ANC's resolution on land expropriation without compensation is just a broad resolution. It does not have a clear methodology on the implementation of this resolution. How much land do you let available for agrarian use? How much land do you let available for business and industrial use? It has no specific categories amongst it to further and get the buy-in of investors.
Yes, indeed. That is very true. It's also true for basically any broad policy resolution that we see, for example, arising from this conference. It is a general overall thrust. We saw that was very evident last time around when it was the emphasis, yes, expropriation without compensation, but don't forget about food productivity and agricultural enterprise generally. And that was always a proviso that had to be added on. And that was just one example of a trajectory towards implementation. But yes, that is what happens to fabulous ringing policy resolutions. They hit the reality of implementation, and even if very good plans can be constructed for the implementation, then it moves beyond that plan. How well is the state apparatuses? How well are they equipped to do that? The political will part of those contracts disappear into capture and corruption? And there are so many side routes that any good policy, well-intended policy resolution can take.
When you look at this policy conference, it comes at a time where the country is faced with hard economic times. The cost of living has gone up. Inflation has gone up. You look at the interest rates that have just been hiked by the Reserve Bank Governor Lesego Kganyago by 0.75 basis points. It comes at a time when there is no stimulus package that is the economic trajectory of the country, which encompasses both business, government and labor. In fact, the president has been slated by labor and by business with the latest proposal, he was also slammed by former President Mbeki to say that in your State of the Nation address, he said within 100 days there will be a stimulus package for the country's economic trajectory, which encompasses all stakeholders in it. 100 days later, gone by, there's nothing. It's slated by business, it's slated by labor. What can we anticipate going forward especially with his policy conference of his governing party sitting, where they've reached a ceiling when it comes to policy proposals?
Well, that is definitely one of the areas that I and many, many thousands of others will be watching very closely. If after all these efforts of so many specific initiatives in this regard, still there is nothing convincing to deal with the economic crisis, can these delegates here at a relatively limited event like this actually come up with imaginative, profound alternatives? That is definitely something to watch out for. I have my doubts whether we're going to see this emerging, because we do not see that emerging from the policy package, from the policy documents so far put together. So there is a huge gap which exists between existing plans, the crisis, the scope of the crisis, and that is changing all the time and even getting worse. But that means there's so much more of a need for dramatic action and alternatives being offered at an event like this. I do not see that forthcoming. So it is going to be more stumbling on, in all probability, after the conference and hoping for a new package to be taken effect. But very importantly, South Africans generally are totally saturated and cynical about new packages and plans being on offer, because there are so many ones that have come and gone without any dramatic new thrust to persuade us that it can be different going forward.
Prof, with the ANC being too inward-looking, particularly leading up to this policy conference, leading up to their 55th National Conference, and from their 54th National Conference in 2017, a resolution that is a bone of contention, the step-aside resolution. You've got KwaZulu-Natal saying it must be scrapped in its entirety. You've got Gauteng saying you've got Limpopo saying it must be scrapped in its entirety. You've recently had the Ekurhuleni ANC caucus through its caucus spokesperson and whip, Jongizizwe Nhlabati, and deputy chairperson of Ekurhuleni saying that this policy conference must deliberate whether they are better with or without the step-aside resolution. What can we take out of this? Because it pretty much goes back to that debate in 2017 in the policy conference of white monopoly capital or monopoly capital.
Yes, indeed. It's fascinating, the step aside and intra-looking ANC reflection on organizational health and the need to retain power come the next election, 2024. And the step-aside resolution really epitomizes this conflict within the ANC. There's so much argument nowadays that it's too divisive. It cannot be used any further. And indeed, it is divisive, but it's one faction that is far more defined in terms of protecting those who are already heavily implicated in existing corruption practices. So it is divisive, but it is also so much ingrained in the fibre of the contemporary ANC, and they will have to have either a step-aside resolution or something similar to persuade the voting electorate out there, the population in general in South Africa, that this is an organization that can be trusted, that is committed to eradicating or at least seriously reducing corrupt practices in dealing with state funds. And yet this central instrument that it has at its disposal, I almost say has had at its disposal, is really fading in its currency to help the ANC through this. So it is stuck internally. In order to get unity, it will probably have to work and rework, refine, some say, that resolution. And yet they cannot really move forward without something like that. But I don't see that resolution escaping serious panel beating to make it more acceptable to all factions in ANC.
So in essence, we may be looking at, post this policy conference, a proposal to the 55th National Conference for this resolution to be tweaked so that those leaders whom are charged, whom are leaders of the ANC, can still contest for leadership positions in the party, because that is in essence the bone of contention. You go to Limpopo, Denim Caesar could no longer contest as the provincial secretary because he is charged. You go to other provinces, for instance, you go to the 55th National Conference, there are a number of NEC members who are still currently going through litigation who can no longer contend for positions politicians. One who comes to mind is Bongani Thomas Bongo, Ace Mahashule. You go to various provinces such as Mandla Msibi in Mpumalanga. You go to Zandile Kumete within the eThekwini region. It's also called for this resolution to be totally scrapped.
Yes, we can indeed expect the Ramaphosa faction in ANC really to try to hang on to the resolution, the step-aside resolution, because alternatively the political contest is totally going to be opened up. And so if that resolution is tweaked, they will probably try to tweak it in ways that can still retain some thrust, but they're going to remain so subject to many accusations of factional positioning, purging one of the factions. That is not going to go away. So, and on the other hand, they cannot afford to open it up altogether, because that contest is going to be a different contest then in 4.5 months' time from what we're seeing now. And yet, that is an internal measure. Externally, the ANC really needs that in terms of elections. So that is a big jewel it's going to have to fight for itself.
Thank you very much, Prof. We will definitely be deliberating with you throughout the course of the day. Just to not further hold time, I am going to bring in ANC NEC member Zizi Goto, who is also the Deputy Minister in the Presidency responsible for state security. Mr. Goto.
Good morning.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
Step aside should go or not?
We are here, among others, the preoccupation of delegates is the condition and the situation we find ourselves in the country. It's a condition of ordinary Madlamini in KwaTukuza, a Madlamini in KwaThema, a Madlamini in Lusikisiki. That is a preoccupation of why you review the effectiveness of ANC policies. Notwithstanding other challenges that internally delegates may want to raise about certain policies of the organization, but in the main, the preoccupation is about the country.
Mr. Goto, when you look at the proposals, it's particularly on energy. It speaks about the Central Energy Fund procuring SAPREF, which is an oil refinery in the coast in KwaZulu-Natal, in order to mitigate the escalating fuel and oil prices within the country. How do you think delegates will deliberate on that particular matter, knowing very well it also affects and impacts the economy of one of your coastal provinces, which is KwaZulu-Natal?
Let me just say two things to answer your question. I'm sure your other question you ask is about ESCOM. What we can no longer deny is that we can no longer rely on one state, single entity for electricity supply. And I think ESCOM has demonstrated that. That's why we need to diversify. That's why there are many proposals, including some of the proposals that the President announced when he addressed the nation. This conference would, among other things, address how further and do we go without compromising the policies of the ANC, without privatizing some of the issues that fall within the issues of the state. There are a number of proposals when it comes to energy, for an example. The issues about the economy has not performed very well, and we accept that. There's been many interventions since 1994, whether it's GIA, whether it's ASGISA, and so on. What else do we need to do? What kind of disruption do we need to do to make sure that the economy responds? The numbers of unemployment among youth in particular. This conference, among others, that's why I say the preoccupation of delegates, we're worried about the situation in the country. The situation that we are raising about the economy of one of our provinces, to what an extent will that help to deal with the issues of unemployment and grow the economy, the GDP of KwaZulu-Natal? These are the delegates that are coming to discuss here. These are some of the proposals and discussions that the PGCs have held in different provinces.
Mr. Goto, specifically on this issue of ESCOM and the power utility within the country, some of your delegates, particularly in Mpumalanga, are complaining that more and more we are seeing an ANC which is adopting neoliberal approaches to how it does things, where you are seeing a state that is abdicating most of its responsibility and the energy security of the country to the private sector, saying that it's very dangerous, complaining that if we were to close down the coal-powered stations within the Mpumalanga coal belt, that there would be a jobs bloodbath within that particular part of the country.
We need to learn from some of the international practices. The ANC, as a left-leaning organization, if you visit countries such as China, for an example, China, most, if not all, state entities, they remain in the hands of the state, but with a particular percentage to the private sector. Because the state has acknowledged that there are certain elements of these state entities that it cannot run. It must allow the contribution, both from a point of view of financier of the private sector. We are learning from those. And I think the question of the discussion mustn't be that the state must run pools, the state must run airlines, the state must run railway lines and so on. It must be to what an extent a developmental state must be directly involved in the running of a particular state enterprises. And that is a question that as delegates we must deal with. The issue of privatization in the ANC is not a policy of the ANC, but the issue of PPP, which is PPP, private-sector partnership, is an issue that obviously has always happened. Some of the mega projects you see in the country are the results of partnership between private and public, which is government. And to what an extent that has helped, I think, as part of evaluating the policies of the ANC, these are the issues that we must discuss. But we can't, at this moment, even before we evaluate policies, dismiss any options, because at the end of the day, we have not had an economy that has created jobs, that has been able to grow. And therefore, what do we respond? What is our response directly to that?
Mr. Godwa, on an internal, inward-looking question within the ANC, your president appeared before the Integrity Commission on Monday on the issues of Phalaphala. That has caused divisions within your own party. Some people raising issues of allegations of money laundering, fraud, bribery, issues of torturing individuals whom allegedly broke into the president's farm. He refused to answer questions of Phalaphala and the dollars to the Integrity Commission. Can these delegates at this policy conference heckle the president of your party?
I don't think we must use the platform as important as this to endorse gossips, because there is no report before us from the Integrity Commission upon which we can ask a question, whether the president answered the question or not. What we know, the president has appeared, which we accept and welcome development, but then that engagement was not concluded. They will meet again. So it cannot be on the basis of what was said there, which was between the president and members of the Integrity Commission. What we know from what we read this morning is nothing else but meant to drive and meddle with the ANC processes to drive a particular agenda. So it's a gossip that I don't want SABC to endorse. I don't think we must even embrace such a gossip, because it does not deserve any platform where we must entertain it. Because when that report comes, let me give you an example. When the report of the Integrity comes, it says these questions we ask, these answers. If there was no answer given, it will say there was no answer given. But there's no report upon which to raise that gossip at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godwa. That is Zizi Godwa, who is an ANC NEC member. Of course, I am not alone here at Nasrec. I am also with my other colleagues.